Most people think Jujutsu Kaisen is all about cool fights, insane techniques, and overpowered sorcerers like Gojo or Yuta. But there is one creature in this series that feels completely different. It is not elegant, it is not powerful in a traditional way, and it is definitely not something you want to look at for too long. Kurorushi, the cockroach-cursed spirit. Just saying that name already tells you everything you need to know. This is not a warrior. This is an infestation, a walking disaster that grows, spreads, and consumes everything in its path. And the most disturbing part is, this thing is actually classified as special grade. In the calling game, Kurorushi doesn't just survive. It hunts, it evolves, and it even manages to stand in the same battlefield as monsters like Ryu Ishigori, Takako Uro, and even Yuta Okatsu himself. But the real question is not whether Kurorushi is strong. The real question is how something this disgusting, this chaotic, and this seemingly low-tier creature can actually become a real threat in one of the highest level battles in Jujutsu Kaisen. Because once you understand how Kurorushi fights, you realize this is not just a cursed spirit, it is a system of survival, built on consumption, reproduction, and pure horror. And in this video, we are going to break exactly that down. Satoru Gojo is often called the strongest modern-era sorcerer, and in terms of raw power, that title is basically undisputed. But in Jujutsu Kaisen, strength doesn't always mean looking cool or being elegant. Sometimes, it means being something far more disturbing, far more disgusting, and far more difficult to deal with on a conceptual level. And that is exactly where Kurorushi comes in. Kurorushi, the cockroach-cursed spirit. From the moment Kurorushi is introduced in the culling game, specifically in the Sendai colony, it becomes very clear that this is not a normal cursed spirit. He is labeled as a special grade cursed spirit, which already puts him in a category where most sorcerers would struggle just to survive an encounter. When Kurorushi first appears, he already has 54 points in the culling game. And while points alone don't define strength, they do reflect one simple thing. This creature has been actively hunting and surviving in one of the most dangerous environments in the entire series. Now, to really understand Kurorushi, you have to understand the situation inside Sendai Colony itself. Because Sendai is not just a battlefield, it is a deadlock. Inside this colony, there is a strange balance of power between four major threats: Dhruv Lakdawala, Ryu Ishigori, Takako Uro, and Kurorushi. Each of these fighters exists in a kind of forced equilibrium, where no one can fully dominate the others, without exposing themselves to a counterattack from someone else. Ryu Ishigori has overwhelming destructive power, especially with his granite blasts. But that power is not unstoppable, because Takako Uro exists as a natural counter to projectile-based attacks. Her ability to manipulate space allows her to redirect or distort incoming energy, making Ryu's main advantage unreliable in direct exchanges. Then there is Dhruv Lakdawala, whose technique revolves around Shikigami patterns that create controlled kill zones. His ability is not just offensive, but spatially controlling, meaning he can effectively dictate movement across parts of the battlefield. And then there is Kurorushi. At first glance, Kurorushi seems almost out of place in this group. Unlike Ryu or Uro, he does not rely on explosive raw power or elegant spatial manipulation. Instead, he relies on something far more primitive: consumption, reproduction, and overwhelming numbers. Kurorushi's curse technique allows him to rapidly generate real cursed cockroaches. These are not illusions. These are physical cursed entities, each infused with cursed energy, each capable of acting independently. Individually, they are weak, but in large enough numbers, they become a suffocating force. And that is the entire identity of Kurorushi's combat style. Swarm tactics. The more he produces, the more he overwhelms the environment. And the key to this entire system is his insatiable appetite. Kurorushi must consume in order to grow. The more he eats, the more cursed energy he can convert into new cockroaches. This creates a self-sustaining cycle of violence. Eat, reproduce, expand, repeat. Even more disturbing is the fact that Kurorushi can reproduce these cursed cockroaches extremely quickly, and even asexually, meaning there is no need for a partner or external condition. As long as there is fuel, there is growth. This is why Kurorushi actively targets civilians in the colony. It is not random violence. It is resource gathering. Every body, every source of life becomes potential fuel for expansion. Now, this is where Druv becomes extremely important. Druv is technique effectively controls space through Shikigami patterns, creating a kind of large-scale battlefield control system. In simple terms, it forces movement into predictable zones and punishes intrusion. For Kurorushi, this is a nightmare scenario, because if he cannot safely move or feed, then his entire curse technique becomes unstable. Without consumption, there is no reproduction. Without reproduction, there is no swarm. And without the swarm, Kurorushi is no longer a special grade threat in practice, only in classification. This is one of the reasons Kurorushi remains dormant during parts of the Sendai conflict. He is not always inactive because he is weak, but because the conditions for his strength are being suppressed. He is essentially waiting for the right environment to exist again. And that environment changes when Yuta Okotsu enters the colony. Yuta's arrival completely disrupts the balance of Sendai colony. At this point in the story, Yuta is already considered one of the most dangerous modern sorcerers. He is often placed in discussions just below Gojo in terms of potential and versatility. However, even Yuta does not enter this fight at full freedom. There are multiple restrictions and conditions shaping this battle. First, Rika is not fully deployed at all times, because she is actively protecting civilians in the colony. This already limits Yuta's overwhelming advantage in raw output and versatility. Second, Yuta is aware that he is being observed by other high-level fighters, like Ryu and Uro. Because of this, he is cautious about revealing certain abilities too early, especially his reverse curse technique output. Reverse curse technique output is important here, because it is one of the most efficient ways to exorcise cursed spirits. Positive energy directly counters cursed energy, and in theory, Kurorushi could be eliminated extremely quickly if Yuta decided to go all in from the start. But he doesn't. Instead, the fight unfolds in a controlled and contextual way, where both sides are testing limits rather than immediately going for instant kills. Kurorushi's main weapon in this confrontation is not just his swarm ability, but also his curse tool, the Festering Lifeblade. This cursed sword has a unique and horrifying effect. The initial slash itself is dangerous, but it is not the real threat. The real threat begins after contact. Once the blade lands a hit, cursed cockroaches begin to spawn inside the target's wound. These cockroaches do not simply exist as a visual effect. They actively consume the body from within. This means the damage is not just external, it becomes internal, progressive, and increasingly uncontrollable. We see this clearly when Takako Uro is struck by the blade. The initial cut is already serious, but the real horror begins afterward, when the cockroaches start spreading through their arm, forcing her out of the fight entirely. This is one of the clearest demonstrations of Kurorushi's danger level. Even if you survive the initial attack, you may not survive what comes after. Now, when Kurorushi finally engages Yuta directly, the difference in combat ability becomes very obvious. Yuta is faster, stronger, more technically refined, and far more adaptable in close combat. Kurorushi attempts to use swarm pressure, environmental control, and unpredictable movement to create openings, but Yuta consistently reacts and counters at a higher level. There are moments where Kurorushi manages to land partial hits or create temporary chaos, but none of it is enough to shift the overall momentum of the fight. In fact, the most consistent pattern in this battle is simple. Whenever Kurorushi tries to escalate, Yuta escalates further. Whenever Kurorushi expands his swarm, Yuta clears space. Whenever Kurorushi attempts to overwhelm, Yuta stabilizes the situation almost immediately. And that is the fundamental gap between them. Kuroroshi is a threat built on numbers and conditions. Yuta is a threat built on adaptability and direct superiority. At one point during the fight, Kuroroshi even undergoes a form of regeneration or reproduction-like continuation, where cursed energy allows the concept of his existence to persist through a new form. It is disturbing, but also important to understand, because Kuroroshi is not just a single body. He is a system, a cycle of consumption and rebirth. However, even that is not enough to bridge the gap between him and a sorcerer like Yuta Okotsu. In the end, Kuroroshi represents something very specific in Jujutsu Kaisen. Not raw strength, not elegance, but survival through infestation. A cursed spirit that grows through consumption, spreads through reproduction, and dominates through numbers rather than technique refinement. He may look like nothing more than a grotesque cockroach, but within the right conditions, he becomes a true disaster-level threat. And that is what makes him one of the most memorable, special-grade cursed spirits in the culling game.